Great. Thanks so much for coming. Also, thanks a lot for having me. Sarah, Erica, Amelia, and all the people from IBeam and the venue. It has been really great 3 days. And again, it's like super professional and it's really great. Unfortunately, I managed to catch a cold yesterday, so I hope you can kind of like bear with me. If I'm running out of steam, I might just drop dead next to the floor here. But I kind of restructured my slides so that kind of like the most important thing is towards the beginning. Okay. So the thing that I'm going to talk today is sort of like some ideas related to remoteness and how to deal with it in sort of like in terms of code and custom hardware. And maybe before we start for real, I want to share like a personal anecdote. So it was like at some point in the 90s, and broadband internet wasn't really that available in Middle Europe, and I was like a very younger version of myself. Went to like the NASA website, and on the NASA website you had this amazing, really high resolution images from like the most recent Mars rover mission, bigger than the things that you would normally see, and this is how it felt like back in the days. So you had these images that would load forever, and the younger version of me, it was like, okay, it totally makes sense, because like they're coming from Mars. So I don't know, that was like for me, like, I mean, this stuck with me. All right, okay, back to this one. So, okay, what we're talking about. How does this work? Okay, so I hope that most of you have probably seen the display kind of like next door. This is kind of like an in-progress version of what I'll eventually install in the California desert in the beginning of 2017. I've been working on this for like way too long time, but I hope that it is at least at this point at a stage where I can sort of like share it and also share with you kind of like the conceptual and technical things that I've learned along the way. So this is like, you'll see something very similar, like for the people in front of their televisions at home, you'll see something very similar like next door. Okay, I'll first describe the whole system as I envision it in sort of like its full realization. There is an autonomous sensing station, that was the thing that we saw last slide, that is permanently installed and embedded in the ground outdoors in the desert. And this sensing station sort of like executes like a custom pre-made software. So it's sort of like the software gets written ahead of time. It gets installed with the piece. The software is very much a sort of an integral part of the whole system. And the main function of the software is to periodically take images and in future revisions, hopefully also like really small sound recordings, and then compress them in a form that can be sent over like a very very thin wire, so to say. Exactly. So this is like this was one of the locations that I've been looking at, sort of like in the high desert. All this land is like, or like the land, it's kind of all sort of Joshua Tree National Park. So this is like privately owned land. A lot of it a lot of it was used more like in the 60s and 70s. And now a lot of this is like, it's being foreclosed, sort of like it's being sold at tax auctions and stuff. Jesus. Okay. To the station, maybe sort of like the systems architecture. The station is autonomous in the sense that the only source of power is the sun, and its current implementation is like it's only using like supercapacitors, so it's not using like conventional batteries that oftentimes have like a more limited lifetime. And depending on power levels or depending on how much sun hits the solar cell, but not more often than once every 30 minutes, a transmission is made from this station where it tries to capture and encode the surrounding area. And sort of like the size that we're looking at is more like sort of like 40 bytes. So when you compare this to your normal smartphone camera or so, it is like a couple of orders of magnitudes, kind of like more compressed. And sort of like for me, and I'll talk about this later also, but like for me, sort of like the interesting challenge is sort of like as an artist and programmer is sort of like given those constraints, like how do you go about kind of like describing in bytes, what is happening, what is relevant, what is irrelevant. Those are sort of like kind of like the inside and outside of data compression, of lossy data compression, let's say. Part of this is also like a custom kind of like or like a proposal for a custom compression algorithm that I'm going to talk about a bit later. The station makes use of a protocol developed by the amateur radio community called APRS, if you heard of it. So this was primarily made for sharing one's current location in a digital form. So, you might go on a hike and you have a partner that goes a different route, and you might want on your GPS application, you might want to see where your partner is at any point in time. And we're sort of like, or this project is sort of like in a way a little bit abusing or piggybacking onto this existing infrastructure. The very interesting thing about this amateur radio digital modes are that they are so-called repeater stations. So kind of like the reach of this device is not only limited to the sort of like where this small radio module and this very small solar cell gets us, but sort of like if it's being picked up by like a repeater station, then it's sort of like decoded and then retransmitted, potentially enlarging the circle on a map where you can receive it. There's also something called digipeater stations, which work that they receive packages that come over the air, and they upload it to some sort of like global federated exchange of such APRS messages. So there is, we had the talk yesterday where sort of like the question or the issue of the backhaul, like the need for a backhaul was brought up, and sort of like this is like a similar sort of like backhaul situation. And sort of like for the piece that I'm envisioning is sort of like the ultimate outcome of this, or the ultimate sort of like visualization would be some sort of like a piece of software that again goes to this exchange, which has like APIs and retrieves and unpacks and interprets the data that comes in. Yes, place. Okay. So why the desert? So I spent some time in California, And I was kind of like, from the beginning, drawn to the idea of owning land myself, which is probably something that that's not so uncommon, I believe. Coming from a country like Austria, it sort of like seemed to me that, or like two special aspects that kind of like made it interesting to me was kind of like, in a way, this futility of owning or cultivating a piece of land that really doesn't want to be cultivated in one way. So this is like, I don't know, it's like a kind of like a tragic thing, I don't know, at the end of Goethe's Faust, you know, like how he's trying to kind of like reclaim land from the sea, so. And then also like this sort of like somewhat stale idea of private land ownership. Like in German, we have this thing called the Schrebergarten, which is sort of like a very small, minuscule house, and it's being regarded as very bieder, as very sort of like outdated, old-fashioned. But yeah, I mean, yeah, coming from a place with hundreds of years of history of sort of like feudalism or so, maybe it's sort of like this also makes a bit more sense there. And sort of like the contrast, or those two things, were something that kind of like interested me. So yeah, so we want to buy some land. Like, what do you do with that? My girlfriend was gravitating towards doing some big outdoor sculpture, which was probably like a better idea. And I thought, sort of like, or my interest was to have some sort of like remote connection to that specific piece of land. So you wouldn't be there, you wouldn't like live there, you wouldn't build a house. Partially also because building a house up to code is sort of like a somewhat expensive undertaking. But like being able to kind of like to have some sort of a link to this thing was interesting. Yeah, a bit about ecology. Sarah also already mentioned in her opening remarks, sort of like this link with the rain dancers, sort of like that they, in sort of the radical software context, that they understood the term sort of like in its original scientific sense, which is sort of like the study of systems within the environment. And being sort of like someone who, like in my own practice, writes a lot of software and code and makes custom hardware. Yeah, this sort of like designing or working with those systems was appealing. And what I like is sort of like there's really like, it seems like there's sort of like two systems at play here. There's the somewhat sort of like complex, dynamic, but ultimately deterministic system of code and hardware. And then there is like the somewhat chaotic system that the environment provides, right? So there's this thing, that I or you guys kind of like, we could program, we could sculpt, we could script, we could shape in a way in its behavior, but very not not organic and very sort of like very, very dead in a way. And then there is sort of like this chaotic outside, which in a way is also like presents itself often sort of like in the shape of systems. So you have weather patterns, you have seasons, you have like the tumbleweed, you have the occasional coyote that comes and chews on the antenna, and you have people on dirt bikes, you have people on ATVs, you have burning trash, and sort of like the two things, the kind of like the system where I feel I have some sort of like agency, but it's also complex, and it's also you're not born to be like an electrical engineer or a software developer, so it's also like something new that was kind of interesting. Yeah, there's this quote that I like a lot about information is the difference that makes a difference. And when we talk, I mean, coming back to this constraint that everything kind of like needs to fit into 40 bytes, there is sort of like in a way, like a very sort of radical, yeah, maybe this is too early. There's in a way, there is, how should I say? Yeah, sort of like the goal is kind of like really to communicate a system that is sort of like way too complex and way too, there is way too much data available, and kind of like press this into something small. So, but it doesn't mean that sort of like there is not, it doesn't mean that you can't say anything about the environment if you only have 40 bytes. So, for example, like there's this classic example of information where, like I think two lovers are communicating via a flower pot that is kind of like put outside or not, whether or not the parent is home or something like this. So it's sort of like you're looking for that, you're looking for you're looking for something that you can kind of like extract that gives you like a way larger image. Okay, maybe also nice is sort of like at this threshold of informational sparseness, kind of like this division between metadata and data totally collapses. This is maybe somewhat interesting for sort of in the context of the Snowden revelations and sort of like the work that the EFF does, where sort of like you also say, like, hey, like metadata, this is data. And sort of like us being in a time where sort of with this prevalence of machine-to-machine communication, I mean, we just have to look at our smartphones. It's going to be sort of like, in a way, kind of like applications talking to each other or services talking to each other. But sort of like in this thing, it's sort of like every byte carries valuable meaning, even if it's just encoding an error. But because like the fact that it is encoding an error is already communicating something to you about like this environment. Simultaneously, sort of like in the radio context, there is often this division between there is the signal and the carrier wave. But it's also interesting that sort of like in this very resource-constrained environment, this also falls apart because the sheer presence or absence of a carrier wave is in itself sort of like very valuable information. And I have an example. I'm not sure if it's readable. So this was like NASA sent 2 probes to space to study the sun. One is called Stereo A, and the other one is called Stereo B. And they're like flying with like a little bit of a distance, and the idea was to be able to use both spacecraft to create some sort of like a three-dimensional images of the sun. And one of the 2 died. So one of them was they were basically trying to reboot one of them just to test, which is like always a bad idea. It never came back up, right? And like out in space, you can't really like go there and hit the reset button or so. It was just in a state where like there was this like you just don't know, right? You can't look, you can't like but like the interesting thing is like you have exact replica of the same systems on Earth, and you have the entire source, you have the code, and you have the thing that runs on these things. So you can like just from sort of like the absence of a signal, you can somehow derive probabilities for different outcomes, or you can fantasize different like scenarios that might have happened. And here this is very nice. So this is like a stereo. I think this was Stereo A. But anyway, it came back to life. Just this August, and the thing is, like, so they weren't even like actively looking that often. They were like once a month they would, have one of these big dishes kind of like pointing at this direction and just seeing if something comes at a specific frequency. And then suddenly they discovered like a carrier wave. And the carrier wave was oddly sort of like kind of like oscillating, but very, very slowly. So it was kind of like shifting. It was shifting frequency, and based on sort of like if yesterday when we were like performing the OSI layer protocols or so, kind of like in the sense of OSI layer protocol, like it wouldn't have, it would just be dropped, right? There is no data, right? It's not even like a valid package. But like looking at the, time for each sort of like fluctuation, where the carrier would like move up and down or get stronger or weaker, they could totally reconstruct, in a way, the tumbling. So like this object was like tumbling around like some axis, and yeah, it's also like very nice, like the way that they describe. Kind of like the states, sort of like observatory status, avionics off, uncontrolled attitude, complex rotation about the principal axis of inertia. Current orientation supports nearly continuous communication near the edge of the plus login antenna with some solar array input. Propulsion tanks are frozen. Secondary battery and propulsion tank heaters are on in between the deep space networks tracks. Encoding. So sort of like a little bit to like how this thing is working, or is going to work. This is using like a commercially available camera kit. It's called ArduCam. Both the software and the hardware are open source, and it's really nice. And like if you're using Arduino and you're like interested in doing so, or like even a Raspberry Pi, and you're interested in doing something with sort of like cameras that can be embedded, this is actually very nice. And this is sort of like the custom protocol or the custom kind of compression scheme that I'm kind of like proposing. So on the top left, you see some sort of like source image. The camera can take higher resolution images, but I'm sort of like taking the lowest resolution, which is like 160 by 120 pixels. Out of this 160 by 120, like the code crops out like a 120 by 120 rectangle. So this is this thing called like labeled source image. And then there is sort of like three different things at play that altogether, like, might provide some clue as to, what is happening. On the sort of like the top third of the image on the right, you see basically the same image down compressed to like 4 by 4 pixels for grayscale information, and 2 by 2 image for U and V. So this is sort of like, instead of using RGB, which is very, it's kind of like, it's sort of like a color mixing that doesn't have so much to do with like the human eye and perception. This is using, this is kind of like separating out the grayscale and the color information into three channels in total. And 2 of those that carry the color information, you actually don't need so much resolution because the human eye is not so sensitive anyway. So this is the first one. This basically gives you like, or it will hopefully create some sort of like very up-to-date, somewhat low-res image, or more like kind of like maybe a gradient that in a way tints the final outcome. In the middle there is this thing labeled sequential high resolution Y. So the software is trying to get the image that has the highest level of detail in the last 24 hours. So there might be times when there is more contrast, and there's times when there's less contrast, for example, in the evening. And it will basically store selected pixels from the image that has the highest contrast, and then it will sort of like sequentially over time transmit the entire, sort of like this entire image. So it's kind of like it's like sort of like scanning a bit like we saw like on the Mars image. So it will kind of like go from the top bottom and always do like, let's say 10 pixels or something. And the idea is that over the time of, for example, maybe a week, you would get in part slightly outdated, but still relatively high resolution grayscale image. Which, since I mean most video compression schemes are more like they totally allow you to, for example, move the camera. But since this will be sort of like mounted stationary, this will be sort of like valuable information. So you might see some pixels that they might be a week old, but it still creates something. And the third thing is the software would compare the current capture, sort of like, the software would compare the most recent image taken with the one taken right before, and it would find the very pixel that kind of like changed the most. So in the hypothetical example of the coyote chewing on the antenna, you might see you might see like a blob in a specific color coming from the coyote, or when a red ATV is parked a couple of meters away from the camera and someone is like looking at the camera, you might get at a specific point like just one pixel red. Okay, I think Rosa is not here, so I'm gonna skip those. Okay, data exfiltration, aka radio. So this is using something called APRS, which stands for Automatic Packet Reporting System. This is like something run by amateur radio operators, and again they use it for what is called real-time tactical information. This is sort of like a diagram taken from a website. So I'll walk you through the diagram real quick. So this assumes that you have, this is basically one station. This assumes that you have a GPS that is connected with some sort of microcontroller that is connected with like a radio. And sort of like you would in a normal situation, you would update, you would determine your coordinates via GPS, and then over the radio, it would transmit tones encoding this current position, and it then gets either repeated or digipeated, and on the other side, sort of like you have again like radios retrieving these tones and turning this tone, like decoding these tones and turning this into something that can, for example, be put on a map. Under the hood, it uses AX25, which is which is sort of like a mode that Dennis and Roel talked about like last year, and those things work on like 144 megahertz. So this is the 2 meter band. The text at the bottom is sort of like one of these messages, or basically like a textual representation of one of these messages. So this is sort of like the time. This is the call sign of the originating station. Those are different stations that picked up and repeated this message along the way. Then here we have sort of like the latitude and longitude. And then at the very end, there is sort of like a comment field. And this is really, like there's a lot of these networks, especially in Europe, kind of like in Northern Europe, and fortunately also like in the desert. And those radio amateur operators, they're like, this is also like really funny community. There's a lot of different sort of like icons or symbols that you can assign to. So this is someone in the Netherlands that, you know, might have moved their sailboat around, or not. And then sort of like from the trips to the high desert, this is sort of like a map of the infrastructure that is sort of like already there. So there are, WX stands for weather stations, and then there's this black symbol, which is sort of like a repeater station. So hitting this repeater station would sort of like, in my case, be like the most important. And there's people with sort of like cars that drive around and transmit their coordinates via the system. There's also like a little bit further east, there's also like different other infrastructure in the desert. Yeah, I mean, the important thing is then sort of like the protocol side of things. This is from the APRS specification. So when you read, you say like, okay, in general, any APRS packet can contain a plain text comment, such as beacon message in the information field immediately following the APRS data or APRS data extension. The comment may contain any printable ASCII characters except pipe and tilde, which are reserved for TNC channel switching. The maximum length of the comment field depends on the report. Details are included, etc. So out of this information, you can kind of like you can learn that sort of like there is actually 43 characters that you can send, and it's sort of like etiquette to not send more often than once every 30 minutes. Yeah, I mean, those are sort of like alternatives that I also considered. There is, you could use cellular modems or cellular infrastructure, sort of like pointing to the workshop that happened this morning. You could use Iridium satellites. The problem with this is that the sort of like the satellite modem is actually quite pricey, so it's like around $200, which is sort of like maybe too expensive for, you know, something that might get, you know, stolen or damaged. There's this exciting new LoRa communication mode. Unfortunately, it's not being used in the desert at the moment. And then also, like I found this one. It's called Weak Signal Propagation Reporter Network, which is sort of like, you know, kind of like the ultra low in terms of how little kind of like power you need to go over a great distance. The problem with this is sort of like it's only sending the call sign itself. So there's not much space for any additional kind of like using this to exfiltrate any additional data. And you also need to have a really precise real-time clock. Okay, sort of maybe looking at alternatives. This is like an image that was broadcast or that was sent from the International Space Station. So you can sort of like from the image itself, you can also kind of already maybe get a sense of kind of like the era that those kind of like amateur radio or the kind of like the previous generation of those kind of amateur radio modes kind of like came to being. So this is called SSTV, slow scan television, which is sort of like in a way like fax. So this transmits like an image, or this is an existing alternative a protocol for transmitting images over radio. The problem here is sort of like it takes at least 8 seconds to transmit an image, and it also uses a lot of bandwidth. That was it. Thanks so much for your attention, and I'm super happy to answer any questions.
Yes, any questions for Gottfried?
Thank you. It's a very poetic project, but I saw the installation here, and I've heard of the speech, but I can't really get, why, why are you doing this, and also your role as an artist in this context, the role of the art.
Well, I had originally hoped to, in this presentation, kind of like go a bit more into, the role of the artist in engaging with such systems or materials. But my brain is a little bit fried from sickness and travel. For me, in my own practice, I'm sort of like thinking of these technological means like code and hardware as something that is almost kind of like almost normal, or I'm assuming I'm assuming a situation where sort of like these types of interventions using sort of code and hardware become almost sort of like a regular material that you work with, and I'm often sort of like challenging myself to try to find the sort of like the specific not so much niches, but like sort of like the specific specific, or like in a way, like, okay, let me rephrase. In a way, I sort of like I want to be in a situation where I would be doing, or we would be doing some sort of like autonomous artworks using technology that work on a scale where kind of like the sign making and sort of like the creation of like meaning or so is inherently being connected with sort of like the digital practices and code and hardware. So it's not, I'm sort of like not the only I sort of like I feel like in this regard I'm sort of like not completely like an island. There is, for example, if I can point to other works that I feel have a similar attitude when it comes to sort of like scale and materiality, is, for example, like Tristan Parrish, or the critical engineering, like their book, their like Vices 7, the book kind of like that contains kind of like a built-in network, or the work of an artist. Yeah, the work of the artist Ho Chun Song or so, who is, I think, sort of like really really interesting. So yeah, I can only ask you to check them out. I don't know if I answered the question, but I'd be happy to kind of like follow up.
But I'm just more curious of how did you came up with the idea, and what is the idea, and what? Because you describe what you do, but you don't really describe why you do it.
Well, in terms of motivation, it was sort of like, I mean, I'm not. If I compare my own or like how I come to doing these things, for example, with sort of like the critical engineering kind of like concept, you know, I'm not so much. For me, it's really more something sort of like personal or something maybe subjective or maybe you know, maybe sort of like you know, like maybe some stupid desire to have this kind of like connection to like a you know, a remote space of dirt that sort of you might own or not own. So it's not. I'm definitely not trying to solve like, or like in my doing or why I do it. I'm not trying to like point out like an issue, or I'm definitely not trying to solve anything. But I'm interested in sort of like exploring kind of like a vis-a-vis of different kind of like existing art practices, but sort of like in the field of you know, of information and systems and electronics. So where sort of like the labor is also not in a way not hidden, or not, you're not you know, you're not helping someone build a website. You're not, you know, like you're not participating in some giant product, like in a piece with a really high production value, where sort of like there's sort of also like an implicit hierarchy of you know, different practices. But sort of I'm thinking of like, you know, if I were to take kind of like you know, electronics and code, or if I were to use this with a sort of like a similar attitude like someone would do in like a studio practice, what would be the kind of like the types of you know, just what would be the types of projects or questions that I would try to tackle?
So it's more like an open exploration of the material of this, but I mean, it's very sort of, it looks very sort of planned. You buy the piece of land and you put this device here, and
yeah, no, well, it's just one kind of like one thing leads to the other. So like,
right.
You know, I mean, it's like, you know, maybe this sort of like long ongoing fascination for, you know, like, you know, space travel and like the final frontier and
yeah,
like,
yeah, that's what you know, it's like your own little moon out there in the desert.
no,
kind of.
I mean, I don't want to I don't want to kind of also like, I try to shy away from sort of like being overly descriptive in what I kind of like how I see it, because I mean, I'm hoping for it being in some way also open to a different you know, ways of reading the piece, or yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a small question. Maybe you have explained, but I didn't catch it. What is the little palette for? Like in your first slide, and also in the, what does it do and what does it mean?
Could you repeat? Sorry, I didn't get it.
I think it's your first slide, if you show it again. But it's the palette with colors.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, that's an important thing. Those were also the slides that I skipped. Those I'm sure all of you are aware of sort of like how taking an image is sort of like a very I mean, it's kind of in a way just counting electrons, but like there are a lot of different, like the camera and the setup of the camera is sort of like determines the final outcome a great deal. things like white balance, contrast, etc. And so you also have different light conditions that might render a scenery in completely different colors or so. So that's why sort of there is a tradition of spacecraft and definitely like Martian rovers to include some sort of like calibration fields, or like so it's kind of like you have some sort of like a reference that you ship with you to Mars. That you use to determine, you have a different atmosphere or almost no atmosphere. So, the light will, light is different in different places. I'm at this point, I'm primarily using this kind of calibration thing to kind of really try to understand myself, kind of like the camera module that I'm using. Because, when you get down to like, this really sparse, tightly packaged information. The last thing that I want to do is want to sort of like overinterpret, something that is just a processing artifact. It comes out of some stupid camera setting or so. So yeah, this is part of the thing, and I thought this is kind of relevant. There's a part that that totally didn't speak about, which would be sort of like connecting this engagement with sort of like compression algorithms or so, with sort of like the larger discourse, like the poor image and the piece in the current the Mackenzie work piece about JPEGs that sort of like just came out, but like I didn't go into that.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Cool. So.